The night was supposed to be ordinary, quiet, normal, a family at home, preparing for another Sunday evening in their Brentwood mansion. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, nothing remained ordinary. Everything unraveled. And what happened that night would shock not just their friends and neighbors, but the entire world. You might think you know the story of Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle's death. Maybe you read the headlines. Maybe you saw the news clips. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared the public for the truth. Because as their son Nick would later reveal, that night was chaos. Nothing happened the way people think. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to live in the shadow of your parents? To exist under the weight of expectations, of scrutiny, of legacy? Imagine growing up surrounded by fame, wealth, and influence, only to find that the very people who are supposed to protect you are the same ones whose presence feels suffocating. This was the Reiner household, a place of comfort on the surface, but underneath, turbulence, tension, and hidden grievances simmered. Nick, 32, the youngest of the Reiner children, had spent his life watching, observing, calculating. And that night, everything he had been holding inside came to the surface in the most shocking way imaginable. You may be asking yourself, how does a son go from living under his parents' roof to being charged with their murder? How does a family so prominent, so seemingly perfect, collapse into tragedy? The answer, as Nick would later disclose, lies in the hidden fractures that no one outside the house could see. Fractures that, when pushed too far, became impossible to ignore. And it all happened on a single night, Sunday, December 14th, a night that would forever change the Reiner family. Let's set the scene. The estate itself was breathtaking. $13.5 million in the heart of Brentwood, sprawling gardens, immaculate architecture, and a guest house where Nick lived, close enough to his parents to feel their eyes on him, yet far enough to feel the sting of isolation. To outsiders, this house was a symbol of success, of the American dream realized. To those who knew its walls intimately, it was a cage, a pressure cooker filled with secrets and unspoken resentments. On that night, the walls that had held so much tension finally cracked. Romy, the daughter, was the one who would ultimately discover the horror. Only 27, she had been living her own life, yet drawn back into the orbit of her family by fate, by circumstance, by something almost inexplicable. She walked into a scene that no one could have anticipated. A sight so shocking, so devastating, that the police would later describe it as among the most disturbing they had ever encountered. Her initial reaction was disbelief, shock, then a rush of adrenaline, a desperate attempt to process the impossible. And in that moment, the chain of events that had been quietly building for years reached its inevitable, horrifying conclusion. But what about Nick? How did he become the center of this storm? What drove a son to commit acts so unimaginable? And why, after months of silence and speculation, did he finally choose to speak out? The answers lie in layers. Layers of family tension, psychological pressure, and a sequence of chaotic events that no one outside the house could have predicted. According to reports, Nick didn't act in isolation. Allegations point to Tracy Reiner, whose role is still murky but undeniably pivotal. Some say she was an accomplice, others suggest she was manipulated. But the truth, as Nick reveals it, is far more complicated than anyone anticipated. Multiple sharp force injuries were listed as the cause of death. Homicide, as the official manner of death. Simple words, clinical on paper, but unimaginably gruesome in reality. These labels hide the chaos, the fear, the split-second decisions, and the torrent of emotion that engulfed that house. When Romy called the police, she did more than report a crime. She bore witness to the collapse of a family under pressure, a family that had appeared flawless to the outside world, but was anything but. The media, as expected, descended immediately. Headlines screamed, speculation ran rampant, and public opinion polarized. But the real story, the one that Nick would finally reveal, had little to do with what the press reported. The chaos, the fear, the shocking confessions, none of that was captured in news clips or sensationalist articles. And Nick's account would overturn much of what the public believed. He promised to explain not just what happened, but why it happened. And as he began to speak, The details emerged like shards of glass, sharp, piercing, and impossible to ignore. You have to understand, the Reiner family's tragedy is not just a story of murder. It's a story of betrayal, of secrets, of relationships twisted by pressure and unspoken grievances. Every family has its conflicts, but some conflicts hide deeper currents, dangerous and unseen until they erupt. That night, those currents became a torrent. And while many assumed they understood the dynamics, no one outside the house had any idea of the storm brewing within. Nick's revelations would expose these currents, showing us a picture so complete, so raw, it would leave even seasoned observers stunned. What Nick revealed touches on questions everyone wants to know. How did a seemingly normal family spiral into violence? What role did each family member play? Who knew what and when? And perhaps most importantly, how could such a tragedy happen in a household that seemed so controlled, so ordered, so perfect? The answers lie in the chaos, in the miscommunications, the hidden resentments, the flashpoints that no one saw coming. And for months, the public could only speculate. Until now. But there's more. According to Nick, what happened that night was not premeditated in the way people might think. It was a series of rapid, unpredictable events, escalating faster than anyone could react. Every decision, every action, every scream, every panic-stricken step contributed to the outcome. And as he walked through the story, layer by layer, he painted a picture of confusion, fear, and desperation. A picture that no media headline had ever captured. The intrigue doesn't end there. Tracy Reiner's alleged involvement adds a dimension to the story that is almost cinematic in its complexity. Friends, acquaintances, even law enforcement officials are struggling to piece together her role. Was she a bystander, a manipulator, an accomplice? Nick's account teases answers, but even his revelations leave lingering questions. The tension between public perception and private reality is a central thread in this story, and it's a thread that we are only beginning to unravel. So why does this story matter? Beyond the shock factor, beyond the grim fascination with tragedy, it matters because it is a glimpse into the human psyche when pressed to extremes. It shows how family bonds, no matter how strong they appear, can fracture under pressure. It demonstrates how fear, resentment, and desperation can collide with catastrophic consequences. And most importantly, it gives us insight into the narrative that no one else could tell. The story from the perspective of the person at the center of the storm, Nick Reiner. And now, as we prepare to dive deeper, there's a question you need to consider. If you were in Nick's shoes, facing decades of expectation, scrutiny, and simmering tension, how far would you go before the pressure became unbearable? How much of what we think we know about family, loyalty, and love is just an illusion until tested under fire? These are questions that echo throughout every detail Nick is about to reveal. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever wondered what it's like to grow up in a family everyone thinks is perfect? To live under a spotlight so bright that every misstep feels magnified? That was the Reiner family. On the surface, they seemed untouchable. Fame, fortune, influence. But beneath the polished veneer, the cracks were already forming, long before December 14th ever arrived. Rob Reiner, 78, was a towering figure, not just physically, but in reputation. A legend in film, a man whose work had shaped an era, and a father whose expectations cast shadows longer than the mansion he lived in. Everyone admired him publicly, but inside his home, his presence could be suffocating. Discipline was strict, perfection demanded, emotions often masked behind sarcasm or criticism. You could feel the tension in the air if you stepped into that house uninvited, like walking into a storm that had already begun to stir. Michelle, 70, was the opposite kind of influence, soft, attentive, nurturing. At least, that was the public perception. Behind closed doors, she was strategic, controlling in ways subtler than Rob. She could command a room without raising her voice, influence a decision with a glance, or plant seeds of doubt so carefully you didn't even realize you'd been manipulated. Together, they formed a complex parental dynamic, one that required navigating minefields of expectation, obligation, and unspoken rules. Then there were the children. Romy, 27, smart, intuitive, aware of every nuance in her family, and Nick, 32, living in the guest house, observing everything from the periphery. From an outsider's perspective, they had everything: the mansion, the connections, the prestige. From the inside, it was another story. Nick lived in a state of constant tension, walking a tightrope of approval and disapproval. Every word measured, every action weighed, and over time, those pressures compounded in ways that few could anticipate. What often gets lost in headlines is that families like the Reiners are never just perfect or broken. They are complicated ecosystems. Love exists, certainly, but so does resentment, jealousy, quiet anger, secrets that grow roots deep into every conversation, every decision, every relationship. And for Nick, those roots had been tightening for years, creating a psychological pressure that, when combined with the events of that fateful night, would erupt into something no one could have imagined. Consider this: living in a house like the Reiners isn't like living in a normal home. It's a gilded cage. Surveillance cameras, security systems, the constant presence of staff and neighbors. Every interaction is observed, every word scrutinized. For a child or young adult, it creates a unique kind of paranoia, a sense that every choice could have lasting consequences. And Nick had been living in that environment, in the guest house just steps from his parents, fully aware of their expectations, fully aware of the stakes, fully aware that any misstep could lead to reprimand, embarrassment, or worse. But let's go beyond that, because the real story isn't just about tension. It's about the choices people make under extreme pressure. Families like the Reiners operate in layers: public, private, and secret. In public, everything is poised, polished, perfect. In private, the dynamics are raw, unfiltered, emotionally charged. And in secret, there are moments, decisions, conversations that never see the light of day but shape everything. That secret layer is where the tragedy began. That's where chaos was incubating. Nick was no stranger to this chaos. He had witnessed arguments, subtle manipulations, the silent shifting of alliances. He had seen Romy struggle with her own identity within the family's orbit, trying to assert independence while navigating parental expectations. He had seen Rob's commanding presence clash with Michelle's strategic interventions. And through it all, he observed, waited, and internalized. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand this ecosystem, this family tension that few outsiders ever glimpsed. Take Romy, for example. On the surface, she was composed, intelligent, empathetic. But living in that household meant constantly assessing which parent to appease, which sibling to avoid, which topic was safe to discuss. Romy's intelligence and intuition were double-edged swords. They allowed her to anticipate conflicts, but they also forced her to live in a constant state of alertness. And as we know, that alertness became critical when she discovered what no one expected. Nick, meanwhile, had been simmering in his own psychological pressure cooker. He was often quiet, observant, perhaps even reclusive in the guest house, but that was deceptive. Inside, he was processing, analyzing, calculating. What would happen if he challenged his parents? What would happen if he defied the unspoken rules? Could he ever assert independence without triggering conflict? Those questions haunted him in silence. And those unasked, unspoken, unanswered questions were part of the reason events spiraled the way they did. We also have to consider the social context. A family of this magnitude exists under public scrutiny. Every action, every choice, every argument has the potential to become public fodder. This creates an environment where suppression and facade are necessary. No one can fully express frustration or anger. No one can make mistakes without judgment. In the Reiner home, those pressures layered upon internal family dynamics, creating a volatile mix of external expectation and internal tension. And as Nick later revealed, that mix was dangerously combustible. It's easy to assume that wealth and fame insulate people from tragedy, but the Reiner story shows the opposite. It amplifies tension. It isolates family members from outside perspectives. It magnifies resentment. Money doesn't fix broken dynamics. Power doesn't prevent chaos. In fact, in some cases, it makes the eventual collapse all the more spectacular and shocking. And in the Reiner family, All the ingredients for that collapse were quietly in place long before the night that would change everything. Now, you might be wondering, what about Tracy Reiner? Where does she fit into this complex picture? Her role is critical, yet shrouded in ambiguity. Nick's revelations suggest she was more than a passive bystander. But her exact actions, her motivations, her influence over events that night remain a puzzle. Was she manipulative, coercive, or simply caught up in forces beyond her control? The answer lies somewhere between these extremes, and as we move deeper into this story, her presence becomes more significant than anyone could have guessed. Then there's the matter of public perception versus reality. To the outside world, the Reiners were flawless. To the media, they were emblematic of success, talent, and family unity. But the truth, as we're beginning to see, is far more complicated. Nick's perspective reveals fissures, betrayals, and miscommunications that the public never imagined. Every conflict, every argument, every silent moment between family members carries weight. And those hidden moments culminated in a tragedy that would leave a permanent scar on everyone involved. And yet, there was normalcy too. The Reiners laughed. They celebrated milestones. They supported each other in moments of genuine love. That contrast, the simultaneous existence of warmth and tension, is what makes the events of December 14th so shocking. How could a family capable of tenderness, of love, of joy, descend into unimaginable violence? That is the question that hangs over every account, every testimony, every revelation Nick has shared. This is where we begin to see the full picture. A family whose public image masked a volatile interior. A son whose observations, frustrations, and pressures had been building for years. A daughter caught in the crossfire of loyalty and horror. Parents whose authority, intentions, and dynamics were more complicated than anyone could understand. And in the midst of this, a night that acted as the spark igniting a chain reaction no one could have predicted. But here's the thing. While many assume that tragedies like this are simple, one-dimensional, they rarely are. Human behavior is layered, messy, contradictory. Love and resentment coexist. Care and neglect intertwine. Intentions collide with perception. And for Nick, all of these factors converged in a single, explosive moment. That moment would rewrite the narrative the world thought it knew. That moment would force everyone, family, friends, authorities, and the public, to confront a reality far harsher than any headline could convey. And now, as we prepare to delve into the events leading directly up to December 14th, there's a question you need to ask yourself. If the tensions in a family like the Reiners can escalate so dramatically, how well do we really know the families around us? How often do we mistake appearances for reality? And more importantly, how quickly can pressure and chaos transform familiarity into tragedy? The answers are coming, and they are more unsettling than you can imagine. Have you ever had a night where everything seemed normal, but deep down you felt something was off? That eerie sense of anticipation, the subtle tension in the air that makes your stomach knot? That's exactly how December 14th began at the Reiner estate. On the surface, it was an ordinary Sunday evening. The kind where family routines play out quietly. The kind where everyone believes the night will pass without incident. But underneath that calm, chaos was already stirring, invisible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. Nick Reiner woke that evening in the guest house, just a short walk from his parents' main home. From the outside, his life seemed detached, insulated from the daily pressures of the household. Yet he was always aware. Hyper-aware of every movement, every sound, every interaction within the mansion. That night, he sensed it immediately. Something in the house felt different. The usual hum of normalcy was off-key. A tension, almost imperceptible, vibrated through the walls, seeping into every corner. And then it began. The first signs were subtle. A raised voice from the kitchen, the quick stomps of footsteps on the marble floors, a slam of a cabinet door that might have seemed trivial to an outsider. But in the Reiner household, every noise carried weight. The parents, Rob and Michelle, were discussing something. What exactly? Nick couldn't immediately discern, but their tones were sharp, clipped, filled with urgency and irritation. Something was clearly wrong. Something was about to tip over into the unimaginable. Nick's relationship with Rob Reiner was complicated. On one hand, there was admiration. Rob's accomplishments, his charisma, his public persona, all demanded respect. But at home, that respect was tinged with fear. Rob's authoritative presence dominated the household, often stifling open communication. Discipline was rigid, and expectations were exacting. Nick, sensitive to both overt and subtle cues, internalized these pressures. Each reprimand, each critical comment, each comparison to his older sister Romy added another layer of tension that would remain unspoken, unresolved, until the night of the tragedy. Michelle Reiner, by contrast, exercised control in quieter, subtler ways. Her influence was less confrontational, but no less potent. Nick described moments where he felt manipulated without understanding why. Decisions made, guidance given, or influence exerted in ways that shaped his behavior before he even realized it. It was an environment where trust and fear were intertwined, where love and control were inseparable, and where a single misstep could reverberate through every aspect of life. It's easy to paint Nick as merely a product of his environment, but that would be too simplistic. He was intelligent, observant, and emotionally complex. He had ambitions, frustrations, and conflicts that extended beyond his family. But the combination of isolation in the guest house, the constant monitoring by his parents, and the emotional pressure of living in a household where appearances mattered above all else created a psychological storm, one that would eventually reach a breaking point. Friends of Nick described him as quiet, often reserved, and reflective. He could be charming in social situations, even witty, but those close to him noticed a tendency to retreat, to avoid confrontation, to internalize frustration. It wasn't that he lacked emotion. It was that he had learned early that emotion, expressed incorrectly, could have consequences. This careful suppression, this meticulous control over his own actions and reactions, created a mental environment primed for stress. And stress, unchecked and layered with resentment, can be dangerous. You might ask, why didn't anyone notice? Why didn't friends, family, or staff intervene before things escalated? The answer lies partly in Nick's skill at masking his feelings. He was adept at projecting normalcy, giving the impression of calm while internal turmoil brewed beneath the surface. He had learned to navigate the household with precision, avoiding conflict, appearing compliant, and managing expectations in a way that kept his parents' attention directed elsewhere. It was a form of self-preservation, but it also isolated him further, as fewer people saw the depth of his inner struggles. Over time, Nick developed a sense of duality, the public-facing persona that functioned under scrutiny, and the private, internal persona that processed fear, anger, and resentment. These two halves existed in parallel, interacting with the environment in different ways. To the casual observer, Nick was just another son, living quietly in the guest house. To those who understood, he was a man under immense pressure, balancing observation with reaction, calculating each step while internally wrestling with emotions he rarely expressed. This duality is crucial to understanding the events of December 14th, because when chaos erupted, Nick's internal world collided with the external one. He was forced to react in ways that reflected years of suppressed emotion, learned observation, and accumulated pressure. Each movement, each decision, each split-second action that night was influenced not just by what was happening in the moment, but by a lifetime of preparation, adaptation, and internalized tension. And it wasn't just the parents who shaped him. Romy, his sister, played an equally significant role, though unintentionally. Nick observed her navigating the household with a confidence he didn't yet possess, seeing her voice carried weight, seeing her actions validated in ways his own were not. That observation created a complex mix of admiration, jealousy, and a longing for acknowledgement that he often kept buried. The combination of sibling dynamics and parental pressure created a psychological environment charged with emotion, an environment that would play a pivotal role when the night of tragedy unfolded. Beyond the family, the broader environment contributed as well. Living in a high-profile household means every decision carries public consequences. Mistakes are not private. They can become fodder for speculation, rumors, and judgment. Nick had grown accustomed to this, internalizing the constant awareness that his actions were under scrutiny, even when no one was watching. That constant self-monitoring intensified the isolation and pressure, creating a state where small triggers could have outsized effects. It's also important to highlight Nick's own self-perception. He knew he was different. He knew that, psychologically, he processed events in a way that others didn't. He was analytical, methodical, and deeply reflective, but also emotionally reactive when stress thresholds were crossed. This combination, analytical thinking paired with suppressed emotion, created a perfect storm for misjudgment, confusion, and ultimately, tragedy. The night of December 14th forced these tendencies into overdrive, producing decisions that were both deliberate and instinctive, calculated and impulsive. And yet, despite this isolation, despite the internal pressure, Nick was observant. He noticed details others overlooked, subtle shifts in his parents' behavior, minor adjustments in household dynamics, the ways in which arguments escalated, the small signals that indicated tension or potential conflict. These observations allowed him to predict outcomes, understand motives, and anticipate reactions, but also deepened his awareness of his own vulnerability. The more he observed, the more he internalized, the more pressure he felt. By the time the fateful night arrived, Nick had accumulated years of tension, suppressed emotion, and psychological preparation. He knew how arguments might escalate, how fear could spread, how chaos could dominate a household if unchecked. And as he later described, that night, all of his awareness, all of his anticipation, collided with reality in ways he had never imagined. And yet, even in hindsight, Nick's perspective is not about justification. It's about explanation, about revealing the truth behind the chaos. He doesn't present himself as a villain. He presents himself as someone trapped in a perfect storm of circumstance, environment, and emotion. Understanding his internal world is critical to understanding why events unfolded the way they did. Why a son, living in the shadow of his parents, under pressure and observation for decades, acted in ways that would shock the world. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. Nick's story is not just about a single night. It's about years of observation, years of pressure, years of internalized emotion that reached a breaking point. It's about a mind shaped by its environment, a person navigating a household of power, expectation, and control, and the choices that emerge when chaos takes over. And it is from this vantage point that the true events of that night must be understood. Because what came next, the moment when private tension erupted into irreversible action, would change everything. And no one outside that household saw it coming. Who was Tracy Reiner really? To the outside world, she was just another member of the extended Reiner family, a figure of familiarity, someone who appeared supportive, perhaps even loyal. But as events unfolded on that fateful night, her presence became one of the most enigmatic and controversial aspects of the tragedy. Was she a passive bystander, swept up in forces beyond her control? Or was she an active participant, someone whose influence helped shape the chaos that would later consume the household? Let's start with the facts we know. Tracy was present in the house that evening. She had access, proximity, and insight into the family's dynamics. Those who later spoke to investigators suggested she had been unusually quiet, observing interactions with a level of focus that was both unnerving and revealing. In a household already charged with tension, her role, whether intentional or accidental, became pivotal. You might wonder, why would someone act or fail to act in a situation spiraling toward violence? Human behavior under stress is complicated. Some freeze, some flee, some intervene. Tracy's behavior, as described by Nick and corroborated by fragments of testimony, seems to fall into a gray area. She neither fully intervened to de-escalate the arguments, nor did she leave. She remained in a position where her choices, or lack thereof, had consequences. Nick's account paints a particularly unsettling picture. According to him, Tracy had knowledge of underlying tensions that the public could never see. She had seen arguments escalate before, subtle power plays between Rob and Michelle, sibling rivalries, and moments where family pressure reached a boiling point. On that night, she was aware that the environment was primed for disaster, yet she did not, or could not, prevent the chain of events that followed. Some reports have labeled Tracy an accomplice. Others suggest that the term is misleading. The question hinges on intent. Did she act to influence events deliberately, or was she a witness who simply failed to intervene? Nick's revelations suggest that her actions were more involved than simple observation. He hints at moments where her decisions, subtle as they may have seemed, directly impacted the trajectory of the night. But what those actions were, and why they occurred, remain subjects of intense speculation. Consider the psychological dynamics at play. Tracy had grown up in the Reiner orbit, fully aware of the family hierarchy and tensions. She understood Rob's commanding personality and Michelle's subtle manipulations. She had seen Nick internalize these pressures, watched him navigate the household carefully, and perhaps even sensed the potential for escalation. Being present in such a charged environment, her own reactions, fear, loyalty, or calculation, would inevitably influence outcomes. Now imagine being in that room. Arguments escalating, voices raised, panic spreading, decisions made in split seconds. Under such pressure, even a small action or inaction can have disproportionate consequences. Nick's account suggests that Tracy's presence was both stabilizing and destabilizing at different moments. She offered calm in brief intervals, only to inadvertently add to the confusion when events shifted faster than anyone could manage. Tracy's potential complicity adds a layer of contradiction that makes the story even more compelling. On one hand, she appears concerned, attentive, and engaged in the family's welfare. On the other hand, her choices, as interpreted by Nick and investigators, suggest a level of influence that may have exacerbated the night's chaos. This duality mirrors the broader contradictions in the Reiner household: appearances versus reality, loyalty versus manipulation, love versus control. It's important to understand that in households like the Reiners, influence is rarely overt. Power is exercised through subtle cues, decisions behind closed doors, and unspoken expectations. Tracy's role exemplifies this. She didn't need to shout or command to affect the outcome. Small gestures, slight encouragements, or even her decision to remain in certain areas of the house at critical moments could change the course of events dramatically. Nick describes a moment where Tracy's presence directly affected a confrontation. He recalls seeing her subtly steer attention, redirect energy, and influence behavior without saying a word. Whether this was intentional or instinctive is unclear, but the result was undeniable. Her presence shaped the trajectory of the evening. Actions that might have seemed independent were, in fact, intertwined with her proximity and awareness. But let's not forget human emotion. Fear, loyalty, and instinct play enormous roles in crises. Tracy, like anyone in that environment, was navigating intense stress. She had to process conflicting desires, to protect the family, to assert control, to maintain her own safety. Each choice was fraught with uncertainty. And under extreme pressure, even the smallest misjudgment can escalate into irreversible outcomes. This is where the contradictions become most striking. Tracy's behavior, as described by Nick, oscillates between care and complicity, intervention and inaction, clarity and confusion. It raises questions. Did she act to prevent tragedy and fail? Did she act to subtly guide events toward a particular outcome? Or was she simply another human being caught in a maelstrom of emotional intensity too fast and too chaotic to control? Nick's account suggests that her influence cannot be ignored. He emphasizes moments where her decisions had tangible effects, moments where her presence altered outcomes, moments where her silence spoke as loudly as words could. This complicates any attempt to categorize her as purely victim or villain. Instead, she occupies a morally and emotionally gray zone, a figure whose choices highlight the complexity of human behavior under extreme stress. Moreover, Tracy's role must be understood in the context of trust. She was a family member, someone whose loyalty was assumed. Her actions, or perceived inaction, were interpreted differently by each person present. To Nick, certain decisions felt like betrayal, while in hindsight, others might interpret them as hesitation born of fear. The ambiguity of her role magnifies the tragedy, forcing investigators, family, and the public to grapple with questions that have no simple answers. Adding to the intrigue is the way her presence interacts with Nick's own psychology. Nick, already under immense pressure from years of observation and internalization, processed Tracy's actions in real time. Each gesture, each pause, each reaction from her influenced his perception of control, his decision-making, and his responses to the escalating chaos. Her proximity was not passive. It was a variable in the equation that determined how events unfolded. Think about that. In a single night, a person's presence, whether they speak or remain silent, can dramatically shift the trajectory of events. Tracy exemplifies this in ways that are both subtle and profound. She illustrates how influence is exercised in quiet, almost imperceptible ways, and how the human mind, under pressure, interprets those actions with consequences that ripple outward unpredictably. And yet, despite all this complexity, the public narrative remained simple: a son committed a horrific act. The nuances of Tracy's involvement, the subtle interplay of influence and reaction, were invisible to the media and the broader audience. Nick's revelations aimed to fill that gap, to show that what seemed straightforward was, in fact, a complex web of interactions, perceptions, and choices. Her role also highlights the ethical dilemmas inherent in family crises. When does loyalty become complicity? When does intervention become interference? And when is silence a shield versus a weapon? These are questions that extend beyond this tragedy, questions that resonate with anyone who has navigated conflict, pressure, or moral ambiguity within a family setting. Nick's perspective forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, tragedy is not caused by a single act or individual. It emerges from the interaction of multiple people, each making choices under stress, each influencing outcomes in ways that are both visible and invisible. Tracy Reiner's presence is a case study in this principle. She was neither fully responsible nor fully innocent. She existed in the space between action and inaction, intention and consequence. And yet, despite her ambiguity, there are moments that Nick emphasizes where her influence was undeniable. Small gestures, the way she positioned herself during conflicts, the way she interacted with others. All of these contributed to the escalation that night. The line between influence and complicity blurred, creating a moral and emotional tension that no outside observer could easily resolve. So the question remains: friend or accomplice? The answer is not simple. It is layered, complicated, and uncomfortable. Her role challenges assumptions about family, loyalty, and human behavior under pressure. And as the night progressed, her presence, her actions, and her decisions would become critical factors in the tragedy that unfolded. Because what happened next, the moment where choices, influence, and chaos converged, would leave everyone stunned. And the full truth of that moment, including Tracy Reiner's role, was only beginning to emerge. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Imagine walking into a house you've known your whole life, expecting the familiar rhythms of family, only to find everything shattered. That was Romy Reiner's experience on the night of December 14th. A young woman of 27, intelligent, observant, and resilient, Romy had spent years navigating the complex dynamics of the Reiner household. She understood her parents' moods, her brother's temperament, and the subtle tensions that flowed beneath the surface of their public image. But nothing could prepare her for what she would find that night. Romy had been finishing routine tasks in her own quarters, perhaps unaware of how quickly the night had spiraled out of control. She had noticed raised voices earlier, perhaps the hurried footsteps, the slam of doors, the almost imperceptible tension that hinted at conflict. But even with these cues, the full magnitude of the situation remained invisible to her, until she walked into the heart of the chaos. As she approached the central area of the mansion, a silence settled over the space. It was not the quiet of peace, but the eerie stillness that follows a storm. A tension so thick it pressed against the chest, a warning that something was profoundly wrong. Romy sensed it immediately. She paused, instincts alerting her to danger, her body primed to react. Something in the air was off, profoundly so. And as she stepped closer, the horrifying reality revealed itself. The scene was unimaginable. Rob and Michelle Reiner, her parents, lay motionless, victims of a violence that no one outside the house could comprehend. The details, as Romy later recounted, were overwhelming. Multiple sharp force injuries, signs of struggle, evidence of chaos that suggested more than a simple argument had escalated. In that moment, Romy understood that the life she had known, the family, the security, the veneer of normalcy, was gone. Her reaction was a mix of shock, fear, and instinctive action. Romy's mind raced as she processed the impossible. Who could have done this? How could such violence occur within the walls of their home? Her training, intelligence, and observational skills kicked in. She knew she had to act carefully. A wrong move could compromise evidence, her own safety, or both. And yet, she was paralyzed by the magnitude of what she had discovered. In that instant, Romy also had to confront her own emotions: grief, disbelief, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal. How had the people she trusted most become victims in such a horrific event? And what role had her brother Nick, living just steps away in the guest house, played in all of this? The questions overwhelmed her, but she knew one thing for certain. She needed to alert authorities immediately. When she called the police, her voice trembled, but her clarity. When she called the police, her voice trembled, but her clarity of thought prevailed. She provided details, outlined the scene, and, most critically, highlighted her suspicion that a dangerous family member, someone close, could have been involved. Romy's insight would prove invaluable to investigators. She didn't just report a crime. She provided the first real lens into what had occurred, hinting at the complex web of relationships, pressures, and influences that culminated in tragedy. But even as the police prepared to respond, Romy remained acutely aware of the household's dynamics. She knew that appearances could be deceiving, that the actions of those involved might be layered with hidden motives or misinterpreted intentions. This awareness sharpened her instincts, making her observations both critical and nuanced. Her testimony, both immediate and later in investigations, would reflect this depth of understanding, offering perspectives that the public and media would never fully grasp. It's also essential to consider Romy's emotional state in these moments. She was not merely a witness to the aftermath. She was part of the family system that had produced the conditions for this tragedy. Her grief was intertwined with confusion, her shock with a growing understanding of family dysfunctions that had long been invisible to outsiders. And as investigators arrived, her narrative would begin to construct the foundation of what the world would eventually learn: that this was not a random act of violence, but the culmination of years of tension, observation, and mismanaged emotion. Romy's observations extended beyond the immediate horror. She noticed subtle signs that suggested the chaos had been more than accidental. The positioning of objects, the traces of movement, the way certain items were displaced, all indicated a sequence of events that had unfolded rapidly, but with intent. Her attention to detail allowed investigators to reconstruct timelines and understand interactions that might otherwise have been missed. Each observation she made was a thread in the larger tapestry of the night's events, threads that would later reveal not just the act, but the psychological and relational dynamics that made it possible. Meanwhile, the police arrival added another layer of tension. Officers had to navigate the complexity of the scene while maintaining procedural integrity. They needed to secure the area, preserve evidence, and begin the painstaking process of piecing together what had transpired. Romy's insights were crucial. She guided them through the chaos, pointing out elements that were significant, clarifying sequences, and highlighting areas where additional scrutiny was required. Her calm under unimaginable pressure became a stabilizing force, even as the emotional weight of the discovery threatened to overwhelm her. The implications of Romy's discovery were profound. She had not only found the victims, but had also become an immediate witness to the circumstances that would shape public perception, media narratives, and the trajectory of the investigation. Her awareness that Nick could be involved was a critical turning point. By identifying a potential suspect within the family early, she provided investigators with a focus, a starting point for questioning, and a path toward understanding motivations and sequences that might otherwise have remained obscured. Romy's perspective also humanizes the tragedy in ways that are often lost in headlines. She represents the internal consequences of family dysfunction, the way violence reverberates through relationships, and the emotional complexity of being both a witness and a family member. Her experience illustrates that tragedy is not confined to the immediate act of violence. It extends into the perceptions, emotions, and reactions of those left to process the aftermath. And yet, even with her insight and composure, Romy could not fully anticipate the revelations that Nick would later provide. Her discovery, while critical, was just the beginning of understanding the night's chaos. She saw the physical evidence, the immediate consequences, and the emotional fallout. But the deeper truths, motives, internal pressures, psychological triggers, and subtle influences from other family members remained hidden until Nick spoke. As the police began their work and the reality of the situation settled in, Romy's thoughts turned to the broader implications. She considered the family dynamics, the role of Tracy, the influence of parental authority, and the long-term pressures that had contributed to the night's events. Her reflections highlight a critical aspect of this tragedy. It was not just an isolated incident. It was the endpoint of a series of interactions, decisions, and pressures accumulated over years. And so, standing in that house, witnessing the unimaginable, Romy had to navigate a complex interplay of shock, grief, responsibility, and emerging understanding. She became a bridge between the chaos and the reconstruction of events, a vital link in the narrative that would later unfold through Nick's revelations. Her presence ensured that the truth, as partial as it might have seemed at the time, had a foundation upon which investigators and the public could begin to understand what had truly happened. But there's a crucial detail here. Romy's discovery did not immediately explain the why of the tragedy. She could see the results, the aftermath, the visible signs of chaos. But understanding the motivations, the split-second decisions, the psychological triggers that drove her brother's actions, that required Nick's voice, his perspective, his confessions. Romy's experience sets the stage, creates the context, and opens the doorway to the revelations that would shock everyone who thought they knew this family. Because what came next, the truth from Nick's perspective, the full account of how events escalated and why, would change everything. And no one, including Romy, could have predicted the depth of what was about to be revealed. When news of Rob and Michelle Reiner's deaths broke, the world reacted with shock. Headlines screamed tragedy, mystery, and horror. Social media exploded with speculation. News anchors offered commentary that ranged from sympathetic to sensational. But as always with public tragedies, the version the world first consumed was only the surface. The official story was released quickly. 2 victims, multiple sharp force injuries, homicide ruled the manner of death. Police were investigating. The son, Nick Reiner, was arrested in connection with the crime. It seemed straightforward, clear, complete. But, as Nick would later reveal, nothing about that night was as simple as the media presented. The first problem with the official story was timing. Early reports suggested the bodies had been discovered by Romy, the daughter. That was true, but it left out critical context. The media framed it as a sudden, shocking discovery in an otherwise quiet household. In reality, Romy's arrival was the culmination of chaos that had already been unfolding for hours, moments of tension, panic, and escalating violence that no one outside the family could have anticipated. By reporting only her discovery, early narratives unintentionally minimized the complexity of the events leading up to it. Then came the police reports. Objective, factual, necessary, but incomplete. Officers described the scene, cataloged the evidence, and documented the physical aftermath. Multiple sharp force injuries, homicide, crime scene details. But these reports, as thorough as they were, couldn't capture the psychological and relational dynamics that drove the tragedy. They didn't explain the sequence of emotional triggers, the subtle family conflicts, or the split-second decisions that escalated a tense argument into something horrific. To the world, it appeared as though a single night of violence emerged from nowhere. Nick's perspective would later dismantle that illusion entirely. Media coverage also created contradictions. Some outlets focused on the shock value, sensationalizing aspects of the story, while others attempted to piece together timelines using secondhand information. The narratives often conflicted. One claimed the violence was sudden and unprovoked, another hinted at premeditation. Rumors circulated about motives, family tensions, and potential accomplices. Some reports mischaracterized relationships, inaccurately portrayed characters, or omitted critical details, creating a version of events that was at once believable and misleading. But the real story, as Nick revealed, was far more layered. According to him, every act that night, the arguments, the decisions, the movements, was influenced by accumulated pressures, unspoken grievances, and psychological dynamics that no media outlet could observe. What appeared as sudden violence to the public was, in reality, the result of years of tension, simmering resentment, and carefully monitored interactions that reached a tipping point. Each person in the house acted in real time, responding to stress, fear, and instinct, not in a premeditated way the official narrative implied. Nick also pointed out that Tracy Reiner's role had been largely misunderstood by both the media and the public. Some outlets labeled her an accomplice outright, while others depicted her as uninvolved. The truth was somewhere in between, a nuanced, morally ambiguous role that required context to understand. Tracy's presence, decisions, and subtle influence had been pivotal to the unfolding events, yet early reports painted a simplistic, almost one-dimensional picture. Nick's account filled in these gaps, showing that her actions, intentional or not, affected the trajectory of the night in ways that would only become clear when all the pieces were considered together. Public perception of Nick himself was also shaped by the media's framing. Initially portrayed as a distant, possibly unstable family member, Nick's narrative was largely absent. Headlines focused on the shocking act rather than the psychological context. The world saw a crime. They did not see a son navigating years of pressure, observation, and emotional suppression, forced into decisions under extreme stress. When Nick eventually spoke, he reframed the narrative. This was not simply a son committing a violent act in isolation. It was a human response to an environment he had been living in for decades, a reaction, chaotic and tragic, shaped by forces that no outside observer could fully comprehend. It's crucial to understand the differences between the official story and the truth. The official story is static: facts, timelines, evidence. The truth is dynamic: context, emotion, perception, and motivation. Investigators documented what occurred physically, but Nick explained why it occurred emotionally and psychologically. These distinctions are essential because they change how we interpret the events. Understanding the why is just as important, if not more, than knowing the what. Nick's revelations also highlighted inconsistencies in the public record. For example, the timing of events reported by neighbors, media outlets, and even some staff members conflicted with the sequence he described. He identified moments of confusion, miscommunication, and misinterpretation that made early reports partially inaccurate. This didn't mean the official story was false. It meant it was incomplete, a skeleton without the flesh of human experience and context. Another point Nick emphasized was the nature of chaos itself. The official narrative implied a sudden eruption. The truth was that chaos built incrementally. Small disputes, subtle manipulations, internalized frustrations, and rapid escalations accumulated until the household environment became combustible. The violent acts were not premeditated in the traditional sense. They were the culmination of a storm that had been forming for years. To outsiders, it appeared instantaneous. To those inside, it was inevitable. Nick also recounted how initial police investigations, while thorough, were limited by the lens of the official story. Officers focused on physical evidence and standard procedures, which is necessary, but this approach could not capture the nuances of family dynamics, psychological pressure, and interpersonal relationships. The official documentation created a narrative framework that was factual, yes, but stripped of the human complexity that made the events possible. And then there's the emotional truth, the part that no report could convey. Nick described the fear, confusion, and desperation that permeated the house. He explained how each person's choices were informed by survival instincts, emotional reactions, and the weight of accumulated tension. The world saw only the result: tragedy. Nick revealed the internal process. Moments of decision, panic, regret, and instinct that collectively shaped the night. Understanding this emotional layer changes everything. It's also critical to note how misperception fueled the public story. Witnesses outside the immediate family, neighbors, and even some staff misread interactions. Social media and news outlets amplified these misunderstandings, creating a narrative that seemed coherent but lacked depth. The result was a collective misunderstanding, a story simplified for consumption, stripped of the nuance that Nick would later provide. Nick's revelations, when compared to the official story, force us to reconsider our assumptions about human behavior, family dynamics, and the interpretation of events. The official record is vital. It establishes facts, evidence, and timelines, but the truth adds context, insight, and emotional depth. Both are necessary to fully grasp what happened, yet only one conveys the lived experience, the pressures, and the psychological forces at play. And perhaps the most shocking divergence between the official story and the truth lies in the motivations. Media reports suggested random violence, possibly anger, maybe instability. Nick's account, however, paints a far more intricate picture. Years of suppressed emotion, observation, internalization of family tension, and a final, critical moment when instinct, fear, and pressure collided. This reframing challenges the simplistic assumptions that shaped the initial narrative, demanding a reconsideration of motive, agency, and responsibility. Finally, Nick's version illuminates a profound irony. The public believed they were witnessing a sudden tragedy, an abrupt act of violence. In reality, it was the product of decades of quiet pressure, observation, and relational dynamics. What seemed like an explosion was, in fact, the inevitable release of long-suppressed forces. The official story told what happened. The truth explained why. Because what came next, the moments immediately following the chaos, the choices, the confessions, the revelations, would change everything. And the gap between what the world thought happened and what actually transpired was only just beginning to be bridged. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When the police arrived at the Reiner estate, the scene was unlike anything most officers had ever encountered. A sprawling $13.5 million Brentwood mansion, normally a symbol of wealth, success, and security, had become a site of chaos, trauma, and confusion. Multiple sharp force injuries had left Rob and Michelle Reiner dead, and the very walls that once represented comfort now bore witness to a tragedy of unfathomable magnitude. For law enforcement, the first task was to secure the scene, but securing it was far more complex than simply locking doors. Every hallway, every room, every object could hold critical evidence. The officers who responded immediately recognized that this was not a straightforward investigation. The Reiners were high-profile, yes, but beyond that, there was the internal complexity of the household itself. A family steeped in fame and scrutiny, with members who were intelligent, observant, and emotionally aware, meant that investigators had to proceed with extreme care. One misstep could destroy evidence, compromise testimony, or even affect the trajectory of the case. Romy, having discovered the scene, became the central witness. Her role was crucial. She guided the officers through the house, pointing out where she had found her parents, highlighting items that had been displaced, and describing behaviors or observations she had made immediately following the discovery. But her testimony was only the beginning. Investigators knew that the full picture required piecing together evidence from multiple sources. Nick's actions in the guest house, Tracy Reiner's presence, the layout of the mansion, and the physical signs left behind by events that had escalated rapidly. The first step in any homicide investigation is documentation. Officers photographed every angle, cataloged every piece of potential evidence, and began constructing a timeline based on both physical observations and witness statements. What they saw, however, raised questions. The placement of objects, the pattern of blood, the sequence of doors opened and closed, all suggested a sequence of events far more chaotic and rapid than what early reports had implied. The investigators immediately realized that this was not a simple case of premeditation or an isolated act. It was a dynamic, multi-layered event requiring careful reconstruction. Forensic teams arrived shortly thereafter. They examined the bodies, noting multiple sharp force injuries that indicated both proximity and intensity of violence. Patterns of movement, angles of injury, and other forensic markers suggested not just physical struggle, but psychological stress and rapid decision-making. Each wound, each mark, told a story, but the story was complex, requiring interpretation. It was here that investigators began to consider the possibility that the acts were influenced by both accumulated psychological pressure and split-second reactions, rather than solely by premeditated intent. Nick's role loomed large in the investigation. Living in the guest house, he had proximity and opportunity, which made him a person of interest immediately. Investigators had to determine his movements that night, understand what he observed, and assess whether his actions were deliberate or reactive. Nick's own perspective, revealed months later, would clarify many of the initial ambiguities. But at this stage, police had to proceed cautiously. They conducted interviews, gathered digital evidence, and cross-referenced testimonies, all while ensuring that standard procedures were meticulously followed. Tracy Reiner's involvement was another key factor in the investigation. Her proximity, her observations, and her subtle interactions during the escalation were noted. Investigators sought to determine whether she acted intentionally, whether she could have influenced the outcomes, or whether she was simply a participant caught in the storm. Each question required careful evaluation, because even minor misinterpretations could lead to erroneous conclusions, particularly given the high-profile nature of the case. The investigation also required reconstructing the sequence of events in the house. Investigators relied on both physical evidence and psychological profiling to understand how chaos unfolded. They analyzed doors, rooms, furniture placement, and the distribution of evidence. Even small details. A misplaced object, the angle of a fallen item, a subtle mark on a wall, could provide insight into how the events escalated. It was a painstaking process, demanding both patience and meticulous attention to detail. But forensic evidence alone could not explain the why. For that, investigators had to consider human